Thank you, everybody, for coming to the Aaron Torres Podcast YouTube page. I do have one quick favor before we get to the video that you came here for, and that is very simply this. You see that little red subscribe button below this video? Go ahead, smash that subscribe button. It really does help me. It really does help this channel grow and my audience grow. So go ahead and hit that red subscribe button. And now, here is the video that you came here for. But that news was, of course, that Auburn hired Bryan Harsin as its new head coach. And I'll be perfectly honest, I'll throw it out there, I'll admit to something. When I first saw the news, I was kind of completely underwhelmed. And so in a lot of ways, I'm glad that I dropped the last episode before the hire was made, because in the last couple of days, I've had a lot of time to think about it, to talk to smart people. And I will admit, Auburn fans, if you're listening, hold the rotten tomatoes that you were about to throw at me, because I'm just going to say I have kind of come around and I'm actually into the hire. Is it a perfect hire? No. There was no Nick Saban out there. There is no perfect hire, but I do think the longer that I look at it and the more that I think about it, it was a lot better than I initially thought. And so let's get into it, and I do think it's important to kind of contextually explain why I thought it was so bad in the first place, and it really does go back to the day that Gus Malzahn was fired. And if you remember, I recorded this show. You probably heard it. It was awesome. Hate to brag. But when Gus Malzahn was fired, I was naive enough, in my first opinion on it, I was dumb enough to believe that, well, if Auburn's going to fire Gus Malzahn and pay him $21 million to go away, they very clearly must have a plan in place, a target in mind, a guy that they already have lined up as the next head coach of Auburn. You don't fire someone and pay him $21 million and pay his staff $30 million if you don't have a plan in place to replace him. Well, I was wrong on that one, or at least I was sort of wrong, because apparently the plan was Kevin Steele was working behind the scenes to try and get that job. Kevin Steele, the former defensive coordinator. Then you have the whole Stop Steele campaign, which is basically the fans saying, we are not going to accept this guy as our head coach. And then from there, the search for a time completely unraveled. Steve Sarkisian was linked to it, and then, of course, Steve Sarkisian didn't even interview. He was supposed to interview after the SEC championship game. He just said, I'm good. Bill Clark, the UAB head coach, there was mixed, things about, did he really interview? Did he not interview? Was he offered the job, etc.? You have the Kevin Steele dynamic. You have Brent Venables for about half a second that was linked to the job before he said, I'm good. And so when you end up on Bryan Harsin, a guy that essentially has no real ties to the SEC, and I know he coached at Arkansas State for a year, and he was at Texas for 2 years, and Texas is in the SEC footprint and all that stuff. When they landed on him, they landed on a guy who, oh, by the way, has been very publicly critical of the Mountain West and the way they handled this COVID stuff. And Boise, they need to get out of the Mountain West. When those two sides met, I was a little sour on the hire. And I was sour on the hire because it felt like an arranged marriage between two unhappy parties. The analogy that I used early in the week, and I never said it on this podcast because I haven't done a podcast since the hire, it kind of reminded me of, that couple that we all know? I'm doing the sports talk radio guy couple analogy, so forgive me. But that couple that we all know? And they both had a lot of fun in their 20s, a lot of spring break. Maybe they went down for spring break for a week and stayed for a month. Maybe they went to 2 or 3 different colleges, and it took them 7 years to graduate. And then they bartended for a while. We all have a friend like that, and he or she wakes up, and they're 38, and all of a sudden they meet another 38-year-old that kind of did the same thing, and they say, well, you're good enough because I'm 38, and I need to find a husband or wife real quick. And that was kind of how I felt about Bryan Harsin at Auburn. Was kind of like the you're good enough, marriage of sorts in college football, where Bryan Harsin very clearly wanted out from Boise. Auburn just needed anyone to say yes, and they met in the middle. That was my opinion when the hire happened. I will say I have come full circle, and I do like the hire. So let me explain why, because that was my opinion before, and I have a new analogy now, or I have a new opinion now that is not an analogy of a 38-year-old bartender getting married. So the opinion that I have now really comes from a lot of different places. First of all, what I like about Harsin, this guy has an identity, right? And the one thing that all great coaches have to have, and I'm not saying he's a great coach, but all successful coaches have They have an identity of how they want to do things. Bryan Harsin's teams are physical, they're tough, they don't beat themselves, they don't turn the ball over, they don't make mistakes. He runs a well-run, well-put-together, well-organized football team. And just because, by the way, when I say they're really physical, it doesn't mean they're just going to run the ball at you 50 times a game and this is 1940s Penn State. That's not what I'm saying at all. What I am saying is that they have an identity, they know who they are, he recruits us to a certain system, he recruits to a certain style, and he wants a certain type of player where every 2 or 3 years you're not changing up the offense, switching this, doing that, and I think that's where a lot of programs have a lot of problems. I look at a place like Michigan that for years was big and physical and tough, and then all of a sudden they realized they couldn't win that way, and they had to go recruit a different style of player, and now they're coming off a 2-4 season. That is not who Bryan Harsin is. He knows who he is, he knows what he's about, and he knows how he wants to build a college football program. I respect that about him. The second thing is he certainly didn't build Boise State, but in a lot of ways he had the challenge of maintaining it, and he did an incredible job. Now look, he was obviously arrived in a great situation off the Chris Petersen era, and Chris Petersen took that program to probably a level that it will never get to again. And that's no disrespect to Boise. It's just the reality of where we are in college football. But when Chris Petersen had Kellen Moore there, they're winning 13 games a year and going undefeated and going to big-time bowl games and all that kind of stuff. But when Chris Petersen left, the idea of maintaining what Chris Petersen had built, that wasn't easy, right? We see it all the time in sports everywhere. Somebody builds something great, the next guy comes in and can't maintain it. Well, Bryan Harsin largely did that. He was there 7 full seasons. I'm not going to include this season because of the whole situation with COVID, but in 6 of those seasons, he was there for 6 seasons. Outside of this one, I'm not going to include this weird one because of COVID, but in those 6 seasons, he won at least 10 games in 5 of those 6 seasons, and in all 6 seasons, he won at least 9 games. That's not easy. That's not easy to maintain what Chris Petersen built and continue to build upon it in a Mountain West Conference that did get better after Chris Petersen left. If you remember, Boise at the time was in the WAC, which was a step below the Mountain West. They go to the Mountain West. Bryan Harsin largely improves it, gets it better, not improves it. I don't want to say improves it, but he largely maintains it, keeps them at that elite level where he won 10 games 5 times, 11 games 3 times, and 12 games 2 times in 6 years prior to this year. Again, I'm just going to throw this year out. So I think that's a big deal. I think the fact that he continued to develop NFL players is a big deal. Player development, player evaluation and recruiting, that is important even in the SEC where you are going to recruit a higher caliber of athlete. And I think the third thing that I really like about Bryan Harsin, it's clear that he wanted this job. And yes, eventually Auburn was going to find somebody, but you had to have somebody that, to use a bad cliche, that was all in. Because you look at the situation, and yeah, they could have thrown a lot of money at somebody and they didn't really want the job, but you can't really turn down that kind of money, and how are you going to say no, and this and that and the other thing. This guy really wanted the job. First of all, like I said, he was frustrated in the Mountain West, he was frustrated at Boise, and he was ready for the next big challenge of his career. He's a Boise State alum. He largely spent the bulk of his entire professional career in Boise. And look, this is a guy that just could have stayed in Boise for the next 20 years, won somewhere between 9 and 11 games every year, called it a career, been really successful, made a lot of money. But he wanted the challenge of coaching at the highest level. He wanted the challenge of coaching where football is the only thing that matters, and that's largely the case at Auburn. Now, other sports matter, basketball, baseball, whatever, but the point is he wanted the challenge of coaching at this level. He wanted the challenge of being at Auburn, and in a place where Brent Venables wasn't interested, Steve Sarkisian wasn't interested, he wanted that job. I do think that matters. And so I think when you add in all those things, I think he was a really good hire. And is he going to beat Nick Saban in year 1? Of course not. Nobody's probably beating Nick Saban next year. I don't know how many teams are beating Nick Saban, period, as long as he has Steve Sarkisian as his offensive coordinator. But when I look at this hire, I do like it. I have come full circle on it. And I do believe that given the circumstances, I don't want to say this was the best they could do, but they certainly could have done a lot worse. The only other things I would say, the only concerns I have are twofold. One, again, you're competing with Nick Saban every year. You can win a lot of games, have a lot of success, and not get to that Alabama level, not get to the level that Nick Saban is at, and at a certain point, your clock is ticking, right? You only got so much time to prove that you're the guy. Now, I do think Auburn fans, believe it or not, I do think they'll be patient. I do think they've bought into this guy, and I do think it'll take time. And I'm not saying that the goal shouldn't be to win national championships because Auburn has proven you can do it, but I also think that it's going to be a challenge competing with Nick Saban every year. And the only other thing I would say that's a potential sort of negative, and I do think it matters, is that this guy has never been in the SEC. And I know, Auburn fans would say, well, Nick Saban had never been in the SEC before he got to LSU, and Urban Meyer had never been in the SEC before he got to Florida. And I get that. I really do. First of all, neither of those guys had the greatest head coach in the history of college football in their own state. That's one. And two, there are other guys that have never been in the SEC that didn't really realize how serious it was and how important it was and how much it mattered and how tough it was until they got there. You look at Brett Bielema. Brett Bielema, if you remember when he gets hired, and it's ironic because he just went back to the Big Ten to go to Illinois. But when Brett Bielema got to Arkansas, he was walking in with his chest puffed out. He's got a big chest, too. He's a big boy. His chest puffed out, and this is how we're going to do things, and teams are going to have to adjust to us. We're not adjusting to them. How'd that go for Brett Bielema? Yes, he did get Arkansas to 8 wins one season, but 4 out of 5 seasons, he did have a losing record in the SEC, and eventually he was fired. Butch Jones, kind of the same thing. From the Midwest, won a bunch at Central Michigan, won a bunch at this place and that place, and had success. Then he got to the SEC, and it's a whole other deal. Now, I think Bryan Harsin is more well-rounded. I think he's a better coach than either of those guys. But I do think it's a challenge. I do think it's a challenge to recruit at this level, to recruit in an area that you've never recruited before, to recruit with Georgia and Alabama right in your backyard, not to mention Florida and LSU and all the teams that you're going to be competing against. And I do think it's a challenge, the week in, week out grind of the SEC. And I know, like the SEC I thought was pretty down this year. Outside of those top 3 of Alabama, A&M, and Florida, I didn't think anybody was that good. Georgia was kind of interesting by the end of the year. So that is my only concern. He's never been in the SEC, and I do think it's a bigger challenge than the people that say, oh, that's overrated. No, it's not. It's really tough to walk into the SEC if you've never been there before. I know Urban Meyer and Nick Saban did it, but that is my only concern with him. But overall, I do like the Bryan Harsin hire. And I do think it's interesting. And so that just about wraps up the college football coaching carousel, of course, with the exception of Kellen Moore, with Boise, and we'll see if they do go Kellen Moore. But yeah, it will be interesting. Last little topic I do want to get to. Did you see this story from Sunday? And it's kind of a college football coaching carousel thing.